Welcome to a special episode of Now You Know One Autistic. This week, we'll be discussing the topic of abuse in relationships, specifically relationships between neurotypicals and neurodivergents. In researching this topic, we reached out to people across various social media platforms and asked them to share their experiences of abuse with us. We read everything that was sent to us, and we chose a selection of the stories to talk about today. A lot of the stories that were sent to us involved subject matter that was either too graphic to feel comfortable discussing in this forum, or involved subjects that Leah and I are simply not qualified to discuss with the depths of understanding necessary to be helpful. In the end, we chose a handful of stories that each of us can relate to from our own and joint experience. If you or someone that you care about is or may be the victim of abuse, we've included a selection of resources in the episode description. Listener discretion is advised.
Let's get started. Hi, Moshe.
Hi, Leah.
How are you today, sweetheart?
I'm well, thank you.
So today is the beginning of a few episodes that we're going to be doing in the upcoming future that are less lighthearted than our usual fare.
Yes, you may have noticed our usual happy intro is absent in lieu of I guess you could call it like service announcement, just to kind of lend itself a little bit more to the more serious tone of this episode.
Yes, and maybe some future ones, but this is the only one we have planned for the moment.
Right.
I do feel the need to also include the fact that when we are sharing the stories, all the names have been left out.
Absolutely.
As well as any distinguishing characteristics, maybe other than gender, right? So it'll be like my husband, my wife, stuff like that.
Right.
So the first thing that I thought would be helpful to do would be to define abuse. You would think that most people would know or understand what abuse is, but it's actually quite complex, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, traditionally, when you think of the word abuse, you sometimes think of like hitting and slapping and pushing and punching and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a lot more complex than that, isn't it?
It absolutely is. So I'm going to just read a little bit of an overview that I found while I was doing some research. So abuse is when someone causes us harm or distress. It can take many forms ranging from disrespect to causing someone physical or mental pain. It can occur in someone's home, a care home, a hospital, or in a public place. Often the people who commit abuse are taking advantage of a special relationship. So that is an important part of what we're talking about today, because a relationship between a neurotypical and a neurodivergent is an extremely special relationship. And if one or the other doesn't handle it with the care that it deserves, then it can definitely devolve into something that can cause harm, pain, and distress to one or both people.
Yes, absolutely.
They may be a family member, a friend, or a paid care worker who we expect to trust. Sometimes abuse is not intentional, but happens because someone does not have the skills or support needed to take care of someone. That does not make the impact of it any less, but it can help to understand how it happened. Anyone, and this is another important point that we want to touch on, anyone can become a victim of abuse. It is no reflection of their intelligence, strength, or worth. However, people with care and support needs, such as older people or people with disabilities, are more likely to be abused or neglected. They may be seen as an easy target or may be less likely to identify abuse themselves or report it. People with communication difficulties can be particularly at risk because they may not be able to alert others. Sometimes people may not even be aware that they are being abused, and this is especially likely if they have a cognitive impairment. Abusers may try to prevent access to the person that they abuse. That's called isolation. That's well known when it comes to domestic abuse, but it can happen in all types of abuse, right, Moshe?
Absolutely. And unfortunately, when it comes to the forms of abuse that a lot of neurodivergents and autistics are particularly susceptible to, isolation is, in my experience and my research, very common along with emotional abuse, because unfortunately people with developmental or cognitive impairments or developmental delays like autistics such as myself they end up being very suggestible and sometimes a little bit too trusting.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I mentioned in a previous episode, I don't even remember which one at this point, I discussed the comparison between autism and people with Williams syndrome, which is a genetic disorder that actually really would have been a good topic in our discussion on the genetics of autism, and we may actually
I think we may have talked about
it. But one of the characteristics that is common between people with Williams syndrome and people with autism, and actually when you like really look into it, other forms of cognitive impairment, is that they don't really have a concept of fear.
Mm-hmm.
So
like self-protection.
They end up trusting everyone, because when you lack the ability to understand nuance, then you have really no choice but to take everyone at their word. And often that does leave you susceptible to suggestion, which can easily translate in the wrong hands, we'll say, to emotional and psychological abuse.
Right. So the flip side of that is also when someone has a cognitive impairment like that, they can't necessarily read signs, symptoms, know how to communicate with others, know how they should be treating others. And that can lead itself to abuse in the other direction if the other individual doesn't understand exactly what's going on or how to deal with it.
Yeah.
It's not purposeful abuse. It's
right.
Almost abuse by neglect.
Right. And that is really, it's a bit of a slippery slope. And unfortunately, it's certainly not talked about enough.
Oh, it will be in this episode.
Yeah. And that's actually the impetus, one of the impetuses that we had for doing this episode was in researching topics for discussion on this podcast. We talked about a study that I'd read at one point where people with autism and neurodiversity end up being far more susceptible, for the reasons that I mentioned, to abuse. And so Leah discussed, as we will, in this episode, about how that often happens the other way. So we did some research and discovered that, unfortunately, there is significant abuse that goes the other way, where the person with neurodivergency or autism can often be the abuser.
There is scientifically documented abuse in the other direction, but the overwhelming majority of what I found was when I asked that women in my exact position, so often with a male spouse who's neurodivergent, are suffering really bad abuse, and it may not actually be the husband's fault, again, because he doesn't understand, and it's not her fault, because what we're told is when we have a neurodivergent partner, we just have to accept everything, because otherwise it's ableism, or you're not accepting them, or you're trying to, change them, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
And I mean, we certainly don't want to say in this podcast that people with autism are like naturally abusing other people. It's really, it's kind of like pulling the curtain back a little bit and saying that, yes, people with cognitive impairments or developmental delays or intellectual disabilities are, legitimately disabled. And a lot of the time they don't necessarily have ill intention.
Right.
But they can just as easily perpetrate the same kinds of abuse that they would find in a neurotypical person. And it's even, as you mentioned, it's even more unfortunate because a lot of the time they're not even aware that they're doing it.
I got an overwhelming response. And again, it was mostly women in my situation. And mostly they just wanted to be heard. They were like, thank you so much for asking this, because nobody believes me. Yeah. And that's really hard.
Yeah. So we have a bunch of stories.
Some of them were as you said, they were too harsh to share, and I won't be. And we won't be, because they require professional intervention, which I suggested to these people personally and showed a lot of concern there.
And yeah, it was actually very upsetting, some of the stories that people shared with us, not just as an autistic, hearing what other neurodivergents are doing to other people, but, as a man, and I mean, I'll share my experiences a little bit later on in the show, but you definitely don't like to see that kind of thing being perpetuated it unfortunately sort of perpetuates a stereotype that is not very pleasant.
Yes, but a lot of people also don't understand that men can be abused too.
They can.
And of the two of us, I think we both suffered a lot of abuse in past relationships. But of the two of us, you suffered at least an equal amount, if not more.
Yeah. And it was one of those situations that really, it really made me question myself. And it unfortunately brought me to our relationship with a lot of damage that we'll, of course, be happy to discuss. I mean, not happy, but we'll be open to discussing.
We'll be open to discussing, maybe not all in this episode because it's a lot.
Right.
And as we always keep saying, the ultimate solution to all of these problems is communication. That's why we just never stop talking about it.
Yes, the thread that weaves itself through our podcast and in previous, current, and future episodes is the cure-all, if you will, to all of these situations is healthy communication. And when communication becomes unhealthy, identifying it and coming up with a solution, which unfortunately in many cases does sometimes involve ending the relationship.
Let's speak very briefly about the types of abuse. Let's touch on them real quick. And it's important not because I want to give a list or be like nerdy or whatever, but it's important because some of it is actually extremely nuanced, which could be why a lot of neurodivergents struggle with the concepts because there are obvious ones. So the first few are obvious. Physical abuse, right? Moshe,
Punching, kicking,
Yeah.
slapping,
Yeah.
pushing, like the outward signs of abuse. You would traditionally, and I say traditionally like half a century ago when you would say my spouse is abusive, it almost always meant that
Hitting.
that they hit them.
Mm-hmm. Domestic violence or abuse, which is, again, it's mostly looked at as one spouse hitting the other. Or, just if the wife burns the food, just getting really mad at her. Or, if the guy doesn't, I don't know, mow the lawn properly, she makes fun of him or something. All those types of things can be considered domestic abuse. Also, violence is within that as well.
Domestic abuse is typically, abuse that happens between a couple.
Mm-hmm. Sexual abuse is obvious.
Right.
It's often somebody abusing their authority in order to do sexual things to someone else, or people doing things to each other without consent.
Sexual abuse can actually be both extremes. It can be forceful sexual acts performed or demanded from or on one person, but it can also be withholding sexual acts from one or person, such as I won't do this with you if you don't do this for me.
Got it. Psychological or emotional abuse. That one's pretty obvious as well. So, not being careful with someone's emotions, saying insults to them, being mean to them, putting them down, destroying their self-esteem.
Gaslighting.
Gaslighting.
Gaslighting is an interesting subject, especially when it comes to autistics. And it really comes back to something that we mentioned in our previous episode on communications and resolving conflicts, which you can listen to on all podcasting and streaming sites, that have to do with the need for an autistic to always be right or to correct inaccuracies that even they determine. And it can often sound very much like, you always do this, or you never do that, or I didn't do the thing, you must have imagined it.
My favorite one is, I was fine until you brought it up.
Right.
Like, no, you weren't, because I wouldn't have brought it up.
You're always bringing up that I forget things, or you're always mentioning that I embarrass you, or you're always doing the thing, or you're just saying that to upset. Basically you're saying a thing in a way that makes the other person question their own memory,
Right.
which is very dangerous.
Financial or material abuse, that is taking money from people that you shouldn't take, or taking their things or using them for stuff. Like you did mention, I believe, that coworker of yours who you paid off her credit card, she was actually financially abusive to you.
Yes. If you cared about me, you would pay my credit card bill. If you were a really nice guy, like you're not a bad person, are you? Because you're not a mean boss. You're a nice boss. And if you were a nice boss, you would You would pay off my credit card bill so I could come to work and be in a better frame of mind. That is definitely financial abuse.
Right. Now, those ones were the relatively obvious ones. These ones are more nuanced. Discriminatory abuse.
Discriminatory abuse is extremely nuanced, and it can also fall into a category of any of the other forms of abuse. For example, if you are a particular kind of person based on your culture, your race, your income class, you know, I'm trying to think of
someone refusing to give you a job because you're a certain gender or your skin is a certain color.
Yes, basically crying racism or sexism or transphobia or homophobia or income disparity. You're only rejecting me for this job because I'm poor, or basically using their status against them.
You won't date me because I'm not 6'4", like that kind of thing.
Like, I can do whatever I want to you because no one will believe you because I'm and you're type of thing.
Yeah.
That is an example of abuse based on discriminatory content, I guess.
Yep. Organizational or institutional abuse, it's pretty obvious. It's, if you're in the hospital and your care worker hits you or does stuff to you.
Care aid and abuse in the medical system is a whole other topic and certainly outside of our wheelhouse.
Oh, absolutely.
But it definitely does exist. And I'm sure there's plenty of other podcasts that have to do with healthcare by institution abuse.
But it's here, so I mentioned it. Whoops, not. Now, this one is a big one. Neglect and acts of omission. This seems to be the one that on the neurodivergent side, they're most guilty of.
Yes. And it really kind of comes down to a lack of, wait for it, communication. For example, or understanding of what the other person needs. If you don't have the ability to have, as you like to say, the theory of mind, then what works for you may not work for someone else. One of the particular options is affection. You don't care about me at all. You don't love me. You don't love. Let's go with you don't love me. And if you were talking to somebody who might have some aversions to certain acts, they might go, of course I love you. I'm always looking over at you and I'm always smiling at you. What more do you need from me?
Right. This is absolutely from personal experience.
Yes, I made you coffee. What more do you need from me to show you that I care about you?
Yeah. So the way that would go would be, well, I need this from you in order to feel good. And he would say, I'm not doing that. I don't want it. And that in a one-time instance is fine, or in a few-time instances fine. But when it's consistent, it literally does whittle down at someone's self-esteem. And it is a form of abuse through neglect.
Yes. And again, it really does come into communication, which is something that neurodivergents and autistics often struggle with. And I bring up affection because it is such a nuanced topic. And we have received stories from people who were feeling exceptionally neglected by their partner because their partner never wanted to hug them or kiss them or have sex with them or touch them. And when they brought it up, it was, that's hard for me, or that I can't do that.
It does beg the question how they ended up together. I can tell you we ended up together because of our shared history.
Right.
And the rest of it got worked on. But if you're dating somebody and they're like that from the outset and it doesn't work for you, it kind of does bring up the question for me why they're together at all.
Communication. And if you've just met someone and you've theoretically gone through the process of dating them and then deciding to enter into a long-term relationship, at what point did you realize that this person doesn't like kisses or hugs or touching? Like, how could you be together for months or years and suddenly realize that your partner never wants to touch you?
That's also very complex because masking is a thing.
Masking.
I lived with you for about a month before you told me you didn't actually like kissing.
Yes. Masking brings another level into it because autistics are often able to do certain things that make them very uncomfortable, one-off or for limited periods of time or for a certain amount of time before they're unable to maintain the mask, in which case they'll suddenly decide one day, I don't want you to touch me. And quite rightly, the partner will go, well, you've never had a problem with it. Like, since we started. And they're like, yeah, but I actually don't like it. And I was, I was trying to be okay with it, but I actually don't want you to do it. And I never liked it.
What that can look like is lying, manipulation. Yeah. It's absolutely not. I want to be clear on that.
Right.
But it absolutely can look like it to a casual observer, especially a neurotypical whose brain works that way. If they did something like that, it would probably be with malicious intent. So they don't understand necessarily.
Mm.
The next one is self-neglect. That one, actually, I kind of think about my mom.
Talk about self-neglect.
Self-neglect, I would presume, is when you literally neglect to take care of yourself. So again, thinking about my mom, she doesn't take her medication properly. She doesn't make sure that she eats properly. She doesn't make sure she's hydrated properly. She doesn't do her medical care properly. And that's led her to a lot of health problems very, very young. So she's essentially abusing herself through neglect.
And that can often happen in relationships on both sides. For example, you are so focused on, responding to my moods or my needs or things that I need in order to be happy, that you yourself are not doing the things that you need to do to be happy.
I tried that for a while, but it was a bottomless pit.
Right.
Again, just like you could mask for a while, I could do that for a while, but it's not a long-term solution.
And conversely, I did that a lot in our relationship, and it was entirely self-invented, where I decided that I needed to focus on doing certain things for you and neglecting things that I needed in order to be happy. Mm-hmm. And I would end up suffering from self-neglect, which a lot of the time was my own design. It's like, I need to do these things. And your response would always be, well, I never told you not to.
Exactly. So again, the C word, the communication word.
Exactly.
And when we would dig to the bottom of those things, I would say, I never asked you for that. Right. You're not doing things I asked you for, and you're doing things I never even wanted. So why?
So it becomes self-neglect can be because of abuse, or it can be because of a perceived lack of self-focus. Unfortunately, the word selfish ends up being tossed around quite a lot in relationships. Mm-hmm. And if you are able to gaslight someone into thinking that their needs are selfish, then they will in turn neglect their own needs and will suffer as a result.
Yes.
Which is a form of abuse.
And modern slavery. That was an interesting one. I'd never actually heard of it before doing this research. But, sex trafficking, keeping somebody locked up, or it can be something as nuanced as, the barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen trope, or the trad wife thing, but by force, not by choice.
Modern slavery sounds really over the top, but it actually is quite common.
It's totally a thing.
And sex trafficking is definitely one aspect of it. Another...
Or human trafficking.
Or human trafficking. But another aspect of it can be absolutely innocent. It can be very similar to a situation that I found myself in, where I was unable to work because they could not be left alone. I was unable to leave the room because they couldn't be left alone. I was unable to respond to my needs because it was selfish. I was unable to do anything for myself because they insisted that they didn't get to do anything for themselves, so I had to. And I was kept trapped in a cycle where I would be forced to do everything, and they in turn had to do nothing.
Yes, I know. And the reality is most people would say to you, well, why not just walk out of a situation like that? You have two legs. But I mean, I was there for part of it. I saw it, and it's a lot harder than you think.
The why didn't you just leave thing is a whole other episode. But anyway, let's get to the stories.
Okay. So I was actually going to segue into the stories as well. I'm going to start on my end with the stories from the neurotypical spouses.
Right.
Regarding their neurodivergent spouses. They're relatively mild ones, but they're ones that I think we can discuss in terms of our own experience. So I'll read the story to you, and then we'll talk about it for a little while. Okay. So let's call this person subject number 1.
Subject 1.
Subject number 1 writes, for your podcast. My ex was never officially diagnosed, but our marriage counselor suggested He was likely autistic or had something like Asperger's. I would ask him to do something around the house, and he would lose his mind, saying I didn't appreciate him. I asked him once to clean a windowsill because I was occupied, and it had mold that had been there for 3 weeks. I wanted to see if he noticed it. When I mentioned that I guess I need to point things out if I see that they need to be taken care of, he left the house for the night and sent me texts telling me that I was accusing him of being unobservant and not caring. He threatened to never come home unless I apologized. I had to grovel, accept all responsibility, and he still came home and berated me in front of the kids. That was the day that broke us. I left him less than 2 years later. Let's discuss that.
So there's a few things there that are going on from the outset. The first thing I'll say right away is they clearly don't have very good communication.
Obviously. If I were to make fun of you about not being able to see something, that would actually be very hurtful on my end. So I see where he got hurt, but his reaction was likely over the top.
His reaction was very much over the top, but of course my first question is, was this the first time that this happened?
No.
Is it something that she does regularly?
Maybe, but the thing about it is, if I made fun of you, like, I guess you didn't see that, you could rightly come back to me and say, well, I'm ADHD. Of course I didn't see that.
Right. His reaction was absolutely over the top.
Too much, but it was valid.
I very much subscribe to the policy that you should never fight in front of your children now. And that's very unfortunate.
Now the apology thing. Let's discuss that though. Because that's a thing that was an issue between us as well, where you would demand apologies even for perceived slights when I did nothing wrong. And I'm not the type who apologizes if I don't mean it. So that would stop any healthy communication directly in its tracks.
Right.
And it sounds like they had a similar situation where even though they both seem to be at fault here, which I think the original storyteller admitted, she had to take all the responsibility, eat all the crow, get yelled at in front of her children.
Right.
And then they were able to move on.
So an apology doesn't actually mean anything if you don't mean it. And I think that in that circumstance, putting aside the fact that it was very likely not the first time that something like this happened, rather than...
In either direction, though.
No, of course. But rather than demanding an apology, I would probably have maybe, at least now, I would try to explain why what she said was hurtful and let her sort of understand the effect that her words had on me. And then if she felt that it was worthy of an apology, then by all means.
Right. So I really should specify that the impetus for these stories was me asking people who felt that they had been the victim of abuse. So she clearly felt very abused by this interaction.
Of course.
Abused enough that I'm going to go ahead and say their communication didn't improve and they actually divorced.
Right.
So what are your final thoughts on that?
So a relationship, much like this podcast, is thread through with communication. And communication breakdown in any relationship, whether or not it involves someone who's autistic or neurodivergent, is the death knell of any relationship. Because if you can't talk to each other or you can't communicate with each other, then like really there's nowhere to go.
Yeah. What are you doing, really?
Really.
So yeah, my final thoughts on that are absolutely she had a part to play, but his reaction was over the top and very abusive because if he cared about his children,
right,
he wouldn't have done that.
No, absolutely.
So next, some people actually just gave me topics that they thought I should cover.
Right.
And I like this one. One thing I think you can bring up is how abusive behaviors are sometimes just shrugged off as autism. Now, I think that we both have opinions on this. One is that the abusive behaviors could absolutely be autism. We discussed that. Misunderstanding or some sort of sensitivity or just not understanding that the other person has feelings too, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
Some things, though, especially some of the things we received, because I shared a lot of them with you, and we discussed whether to share them or not, are something else.
Right.
Because every autistic also does have a personality.
Yeah.
And some of the things that some of these people did are not can't really be explained away by just a misunderstanding.
Right.
So yes, again, one of our favorite games to play with you is Autism or Just a Man. With Abram, Autism or just a 10-year-old, and which is which, and what's personality and what's, genuine disability.
Right.
Both of which can be worked on.
Absolutely.
But I do think that for me, at least the temptation was at the beginning to literally shrug everything off as autism, especially because I was told, like, you can't correct somebody who's autistic. That's ableist. You have to just accept everything they do because, their struggle is so much more than yours and you can never understand it or whatever.
Right. And I mean, I really don't feel like raising an issue with proper treatment by another person should be labeled as ableist. Ableist is one of those discrimination terms that, much like anything else, gets thrown around sometimes where it absolutely shouldn't. And I say that as an autistic.
It is a type of abuse. So somebody being ableist, like not hiring you because you're autistic, is abuse to you.
Sure.
But it can be used the other way as a whip. You're ableist. You can't say that about me. But you're hurting me. No, you can't say that about me. You have to accept it.
What I often like to say is autism is an obstacle, but it's not a barrier. If you are able to understand the consequences of your actions, and again, speaking as one autistic and not as all autistics, because everyone has a different ability to function. But if you are one of those neurodivergents or autistics that has the ability to understand the consequences of their actions, then you have the ability to understand that when you act in a way, whether or not it's because of your autism or because of something else, then if it hurts someone else, then it's wrong. And at a very basic level, even a small child can be taught the difference between right and wrong. And not to say that autistics can be compared to small children, but if you could look, okay, how about this? If you have the ability to be in a relationship with another person that has advanced to such a level that it's now a long-term relationship, and even further to the point where it's marriage or a marriage-like relationship, then surely you can understand right from wrong. And that when you yell at somebody because of some perceived slight, or you overreact to something that was mildly offensive and treat it as though you are being personally attacked, and in turn respond in an over-the-top way, then you can be taught to understand when something that you're doing is not right. Mm-hmm. As you, in fact, actually helped me to understand, you have to be above reproach. You have to be able to look at the person and say, I am doing nothing to deserve the treatment that you're giving me. And if you can say that, which to be fair, you always can, then you have to be able to get on a chair. You have to be able to try to lift that person up to your level. And that means not getting down in the dirt with them. So when I would end up in situations where I would be unable to emotionally regulate, or I would have meltdowns over perceived offenses, and we would end up in a situation where you would try to call me back to the ability to understand by talking about what you used to call adult conversations. Like, okay, you can have your meltdown, you can have your reaction, but when you're done, we're going to talk about this like adults, and you're going to understand my point of view. And what I found in those circumstances was either I didn't understand something and I perceived it as an insult, or I did understand it, but I took it for far worse than it was.
But you've also come very far.
Yes.
There was a point in time where literally anything that wasn't you being perfect, angel, golden boy was an insult. And you've come a long way since then.
But that's a really funny thing, isn't it? And this, again, goes back to the previous topic that we talked about how an autistic has a need to be right. Mm-hmm. So if you can consider outside of the spectrum, no pun intended, of the reasons for causing a disagreement, I identify that I suffer from a disability. You identify that I suffer from a disability. You pointing out that I suffer from a disability makes me feel attacked.
Mm-hmm. Why?
Because you pointed out something that I identify as a thing,
Mm-hmm.
and that you identified as also a thing. And somehow you identifying an aspect of something that I identify as a thing causes me to feel attacked. Right. Does that even make any sense?
That actually led to a conversation that I remember now. A lot of things are fading because we've had so much like conflict in trying to work on our relationship. But it actually led to a conversation where I actually once asked you, Moshe, why do you hate yourself so much? You know you're autistic. You're going to have to accept that one day.
Right. And that is the I don't know, everyone likes to quote that line from Seinfeld where it's not a lie if you believe it.
Right.
And the way I like to say it is an autistic can sometimes mask so well that they even fool themselves.
Yes, but they can't fool me.
Right. You're very good at seeing through that. But yes, if you wear a mask for so long that it even convinces you that that's the way you are, then maybe it's time to start understanding that underneath the mask is someone who really just needs to accept that that's who they are.
But that was absolutely meant with love. It was, Moshe, why do you hate yourself so much? Why don't you accept yourself? I do. And if I can, then you can.
Right.
And that's ultimately another solution to these kind of problems.
Right.
Because a lot of these people are very functional. They're successful beyond, reason in one aspect of their life. So they're then like, well, I'm an adult and I make 6 figures a year. So how dare you correct me on anything, whatever it is. And that's a tough situation in both cases, actually.
It is.
Because I could easily say, well, I'm the neurotypical. How dare you correct me on anything? And you do all the time. And a lot of the times you're right.
Right. Learning to accept that you're a flawed person is a normal stage of development. Mm-hmm. Because when you're a child or a teenager, you're perfect and nothing you ever do is wrong and you're capable of everything. But as you grow older, normally you get to a stage of your development where you can accept that you are very talented in some ways and not very talented in others. And unless you happen to be, God, you are capable of making mistakes. Mm-hmm. And for whatever reason, a lot of people who have autism are so protective of appearing vulnerable that it ends up coming across as being insulted by the truth.
We're also very aggressive. It does come across as aggressive. So a couple of things I wanted to cover on this topic, and then we should move on.
Right.
The first one was, though it absolutely wasn't abuse, when Moshe would have meltdowns or react in the way he did, if the outside observer had watched us or seen us, and it did happen a couple of times, they would be very concerned for my safety. He would never hurt me, even in the midst of a meltdown. He had that kind of control. But from the outside, it was extremely scary to look at. So that's one thing. So the outside observer may see things that aren't abuse as abuse and be very concerned. The second thing is, I just wanted to just put a little bow on this, where some things even the autistic person knows are wrong, and they do them anyway. Because that's a human characteristic. Everybody does that. And if you're doing that and it's causing somebody that you love harm or to be hurt, you really need to rethink that, whether you're neurotypical or neurodivergent.
Exactly.
Right. Next. Subject number 3. I've recently finished reading Asperger's in Love. I know that's not the acceptable term anymore, and was fairly shocked on the chapters about abuse, because I've seen so many times in this group people saying autistic folks aren't inherently abusive. And I've really, really been trying hard to give my husband the benefit of the doubt for too many years. About 70% of AS men answered yes to the question, had they ever been verbally abusive to their partners. 40% of AS men in my research said that at some time in their relationship, they had been physically abusive toward their partner. Now, this isn't glowing, but this was one of the sort of scientific studies that I had been referring to. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, the first thing that I think about is that remarkable self-reflection on the part of the AS, I presume, refers to autism spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
So it sounds like you have people who have autism self-admitting that they abuse their partners. I mean, not like as a rule, but as a very high percentage, which...
Even before we were together, you had that level of insight. When I would talk to you about, let's call her first wife, you admitted that you did some things.
Yeah. And that gets to the thing that I mentioned about appearing above reproach. Because if you are sitting there and taking abuse and you always respond rationally, reflectively, then you're above reproach and you can say, you know what, I'm sorry, but you are not treating me fairly. But if you hit back or you get involved in a back and forth, then it basically allows them to turn around and say, see, you're also the one who's guilty, so I'm not doing anything wrong. We're both doing it wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, when you don't have the self-control that a lot of neurodivergents don't, it makes it very easy to get dragged down into the dirt. And if you are also very suggestible, as I unfortunately was, then they can, hit you 10 times. But if you hit them once back, then go, see, it's both of our faults.
Mm-hmm.
Not one of us is responsible. Not to say that happened, but just it allows the water to be cloudy.
But it's actually unfortunate that it's also true. Because it doesn't matter if they've hit you 10 times. If you hit them once, you're just as guilty. That's maybe just my own moral judgment or my own theories.
And I agree with you. I do agree with you.
This one, subject number 4, is more actually on my end. It's more of a thing that I struggle with. I identified with this person and I messaged them and I told them so. I was in an abusive relationship before meeting my husband who has ASD. I have PTSD as a result of my former relationship. However, ASD behaviors within my current relationship trigger PTSD episodes often. This is because some ASD behaviors, and she's admitting here that they're ASD behaviors, they're not necessarily purposeful, i.e. a lack of empathy or meltdowns, mimic narcissistic behaviors, but without the manipulation, malice, or ill intent. Unfortunately, PTSD does not know the difference between the two, and the emotional cost to those affected with PTSD is the same. Feel free to direct message me if you'd like any further information. This one is more on my end.
Yeah.
As much as Moshe struggles developmentally, I actually struggle emotionally and psychologically, which is a thing that we don't talk about enough in the podcast, and we should, because a lot of people have pointed out that I hold Moshe to task on a lot of things and he holds himself to task. But we haven't had the opportunity for him to do the opposite. And I would be just as open and honest if that were the case. So the problem here is sometimes, so I've suffered from PTSD very badly in the past. I currently still have an anxiety disorder. And the problem with that is sometimes Moshe just being himself or acting in a way that doesn't necessarily mean any harm or isn't even harmful will trigger me because of my past. I've had several really abusive relationships beginning from childhood. So parental abuse, friends who abused me, and my last relationship was interesting. That's a whole episode on its own. And again, I really have to ask them before I disclose all of that stuff. But suffice it to say that it was traumatic. And a lot of times just him behaving in a way that's natural to him will trigger me and I'll get upset, and that will sort of upset the entire apple cart.
Yeah. It makes things a lot more difficult because you have a series of things. You have behavior that is caused by autism but is still harmful. You have behaviors that is caused by autism and is not harmful and identified as such. And then you have behaviors that is caused by autism, is not necessarily harmful, but is triggering because of resembling other behaviors that were harmful.
Mm-hmm.
So it kind of creates nuance in a situation for a person that doesn't understand nuance all that well.
Right. And there were a couple of times where Moshe was like, I'm really starting to feel abused by you because of your emotional neglect. You do this thing where you just go cold and I don't understand what I've done. Or, and I had to really work on that. We talk about communication both ways.
Right.
When you have anxiety, the first line of defense is to shut down and go into yourself.
Right.
Or become me, attack the other person.
So there definitely needs to be clear lines of delineation when it comes to that sort of thing. And communication, once again, pops up. And it's one of those situations where Leah and I have been able to discuss behaviors or things where she'll identify that something that I did or said or acted in a way triggered her,
mm-hmm.
but it was not necessarily to do with anything that I did maliciously, but it was a behavior that made her feel certain ways. And my understanding of that was helpful in understanding that it wasn't actually anything that I did wrong, but it was a problem with her, and that I can help with her by understanding her point of view.
But in order for me to just open up and trust enough to even say, okay, so this is what I'm feeling, and this is what you need to do to help me with it, was at least a 3-year process on your part. And it was stalled because a lot of times when I would get mad at you, you would react the way we discussed earlier with the meltdowns and the gaslighting and the, I didn't and you didn't and blah, blah, blah stuff.
Right.
So we had to sort of rein that in before we could work on that. But you do this brilliant thing now, actually, where you'll identify that something's not quite right with me and you'll say what, and then they'll tell you what, and you'll say, honey, please don't do this. Please, we have so much to do. The kids are here. Like, it meant nothing. It didn't mean anything. It didn't mean what you thought it meant. This is what I was doing. Please don't do this. Can we be okay? Can we calm down? And then you'll hug me and kiss me and eventually I'll calm down. Yeah. So that's one interesting thing that we've gleaned from many, many years of trying to deal with that. In the other direction, I guess maybe it's just, again, understanding on my end. I'll tell him, listen, I'm feeling really triggered because this happened in the past. I know that that's not what you're doing. I know logically in my head that that's not what you're doing, but my heart or my reaction isn't able to identify that, right? So I need a minute.
And we're definitely getting better at working through that, but it definitely adds another layer of complexity to our relationship, and of course the relationship that this person expressed. And once again, it really just kind of comes down to communication, being able to express in a we'll call it adult way what's going on and provide. Someone wrote to me actually something about reaction. What was it, like reaction guidelines or something like that, which we can discuss.
I think we did discuss it in one of the previous episodes.
Oh, we did.
Yeah, we were talking about, you start a conversation by saying, I don't want any reaction from you right now. I just want you to listen. Or you didn't do anything wrong, but we're going to talk about this. We did talk.
Right. Okay. So that is something that factored into this. Right. We did discuss it in the last episode. And it was, the thing that you did was triggering for me, not because of anything you did, but right now I just need you to understand that I'm feeling whatever way I'm feeling, and I need you to help me through it with the understanding that you didn't do anything wrong.
And that required for me to share a lot of very difficult things from my past, which was really hard for you to hear sometimes. And we had to work through that too, because you sort of had this guilt of I should have been there for you, and this wouldn't have happened if I was there to protect you and all that stuff. And that's more of a personality thing. That's more of a you being just a really great man thing. But we had to get through that as well, because I had to be able to tell you the stories to explain to you why I felt the way that I did.
I mean, the only way to work through a lot of these things is by working through them. And sometimes working through them is not easy, but it's the only way to work through them.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of working through them, this last one was really cool. This person wrote to me, unrelated to your question above, but I was just looking through your podcast episodes, and I'm super curious. How did you two begin talking about this, and how did it actually happen? I feel like I could never talk to my husband about any dreams, and if I do, he takes zero action or minimal beginning action, but nothing gets accomplished. I would love to turn our mess into a message, but we aren't in the victory stage yet. I'm really intrigued by the success you seem to have in your neurodivergent neurotypical relationship. It's very sweet. It kind of made me blush a little bit because my initial reaction was, well, we're totally not in the victory stage yet either. We're not taking a victory lap. You guys are actually privileged to see us in process dealing with these things.
It's really kind of an ongoing thing. But the reason that we did this podcast, actually there were a number of reasons, but one of the main reasons that we did this podcast is because communication was the basis of how we were able to work through a lot of the issues that we had. And unfortunately, a lot of other podcasts and a lot of other series out there that discuss, autism and neurodivergency and stuff kind of give it a bit of a flowery edge to it.
Mm-hmm.
And we kind of wanted to create more of a raw experience where you were talking to a couple that were sort of in the midst of still trying to work through a lot of what is going on with them, but still far enough through it to share their experience and help others. Because being autistic is hard. And being autistic and being in a relationship with someone who doesn't always speak the same language as you is really hard. And being autistic and not understanding yourself for most of your life, which I didn't, because on top of being autistic, I'm an adult diagnosed autistic who spent my entire life just thinking that there was something dreadfully wrong with me, was difficult. And we really wanted to be able to give people an insight into our situation and our family and discuss some of the progress that we made.
Right. So a lot of it is, mess into message. I really like that. But our current mess is the message. We haven't completely cleaned up the mess yet. So it's a messy message, if you will.
Yeah.
But the whole, how did you fix your husband thing? It's a little bit sad in a way. It's a little bit like crazy hopeful on this person's part, maybe, because the reality is if we're doing our job correctly, we'll never be done with this until the day we die. We'll never be done with this if we're doing our job right, because he is not a problem to be fixed and I am not a problem to be fixed. It's just, does that person's garbage go with your garbage? And that's the best you can hope for in any relationship, really.
Yes. Relationships are not meant to be perfect. They're not meant to be victory laps where everything is done and they can just lay back and coast for the rest of their lives. You have to constantly be working on your relationship in order to have a healthy relationship, because the minute that you become complacent and start taking a victory lap, you end up getting hit in the back of the head with a baton. Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So we're running a little bit long in time. So we'll get to, I guess, our final story.
Yep.
And also some really exciting news so that we can at least end what is a very serious podcast on a very hopeful tone.
So this one is a story that somebody shared with Moshe, and it's only one, but it's extremely important because it's two things. It's an autistic sharing their story with another autistic, but it's also a man sharing their story with another man.
Yes.
And as we postulated at the beginning of this episode, people don't seem to think that men can be abused.
Right. maybe we'll save the personal story of my experience for another episode because we're running a bit low on time. But so we'll start the story. This person who, I don't know, we'll call him subject 5. He writes, June 16th is my 32nd birthday. I am an autistic male. I was in a 9-year-long relationship prior to my now wife of 7 years. I was undiagnosed in this previous relationship, and because of that, I really struggled with knowing how to meet my needs. My partner at the time heavily took advantage of me for that. I did everything that I was asked for, but she'd get angry if it was difficult for me or if it had any sort of hurt or upset emotions, especially after she would yell at me. I was screamed at, belittled, sexually abused, and physically hit. I am a 6 feet tall, 200-pound man, so I'm larger than she was, but I never used that to my advantage. It took many years after finally I left that relationship to begin to heal and get diagnosed and eventually learn how to be a better person for myself and my wife. My partner is neurotypical. She had a lot of insecurities, which caused lots of large fights. And during these fights, she would verbally insult me for being autistic. She would intentionally tell me things that would trigger an emotional response. And when I would break down and cry, she would get physical and hit me, push me, or slap me and tell me that I was pathetic, that nobody would love someone like me except for her, and that I was broken. And he mentioned that he has a brain tumor that messes with his hormones. So he has some dysfunction in the bedroom. And he said whenever that would happen, she would accuse him of not being a real man or say that he was clearly cheating on her. But he added that she was clearly projecting because she cheated on him 7 times. He said, I didn't know any better. I am a huge people pleaser. So when she yelled at me, I just accepted it and apologized profusely. And it caused massive sexual trauma down the line, as well as a lot of emotional trauma and lots of dysregulation.
Well, I don't have a lot to say there. The only thing that I can say is that to subject 5 and everybody else who goes through something like that, I am so sorry that that happened to you. Nobody deserves that. Not only does nobody deserve that, but nobody deserves society's general lack of concern for men in abusive relationships or disbelief that men can be abused in relationships. Hearing that story, I know how much you can identify with it, like almost on every single point. And that makes me very sad for him and for you.
Men can also be the victim of abuse, and just because a guy is a big man, I'm also about, 5'11", 6 feet and over 200 pounds. It doesn't mean that just because you happen to be a large man that you're not capable of being abused. It also definitely makes it a lot harder to be believed because, how could someone smaller than you do that to you?
Absolutely.
So it's very rough. And we're very hopeful now that he said that he's in a new relationship and in speaking with him further about his situation, he seems to be very happy with his partner and he seems to have figured his life out. So thank you very much for listening to this podcast today. There's a lot more stuff to discuss, and I'm sure we'll turn it into a future episode.
I think we have to promise them another episode with your personal story now, though, Moshe.
Oh, yeah. We'll definitely talk about my personal story.
I'm curious now.
And because my own story of abuse does not fill up an entire podcast
it does.
Well, we'll save it for a future episode, and I'm sure we'll make something out of it. But so in a few episodes ago, we discussed that we had discovered a couple online that was kind of a mirror image of us. I am a neurodivergent man in a relationship with a neurotypical woman, and they are a neurodivergent woman in a relationship with a neurotypical man. And we've been talking back and forth.
It gets better. We have a son who's neurodivergent. and they have a daughter who's neurotypical.
Yes. So they're a lovely couple. You can find them on TikTok under Studies Show, as well as Instagram, I think. Their names are Adam and Becca, and they are amazing. And hopefully next week, we will be doing an episode, which we're still trying to work out the details of, with them to discuss our situations and chat with them about some of our common interests and things that we share in common. But definitely go on TikTok and on Instagram and check out Studies Show. And
they have a podcast called, I think it's The Poisoners or The Alchemist.
They have a podcast about
it's about poisons. It's actually about poisons. It's very nerdy. Cool. I like it.
You can look it up. I wish I could remember the name. We'll put it in the comments or the description of this episode once we look it up. But check it out, and hopefully next week we'll have an episode with
the Poisoner's Almanac is what it's called.
Poisoner's Almanac. There it is. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Leah, with the save. Poisoner's Almanac, Studies Show on TikTok and Instagram, and hopefully next week we'll have an episode where we'll all talk about stuff. We'll figure it out.
Yeah.
So because of the nature of this podcast episode, we're not going to have the standard intro and extra because we thought it was just a bit too peppy. But again, thank you so much. And if you or someone you care about is in an abusive situation, you can either check out the resources in the description to this episode, or you could look up on Google. But please, please, please don't feel that you have to put up with that kind of situation. Seek resources and get help. Leave if you have to, but communication is key. We'll see you next week.